The last decade of the 19th century was an age of contradictions in America. It was the era of invention, of railroads stretching like veins across the nation, of electric lights illuminating streets that had once been ruled by the night. Yet beneath this glow of progress, darkness endured, in quiet farmhouses, in crowded tenements, in the deep woods of New England. People whispered about the dead who refused to rest. The newspapers called it consumption, a wasting disease that drained families one by one. Doctors spoke of bacteria, of inherited weakness, of science still struggling to understand itself. But those who lived in the small towns of Rhode Island, Vermont, and Connecticut had another explanation. They said the dead were hungry. They said something was feeding on the living. In 1892, in a place called Exeter, Rhode Island, a young girl named Mercy Brown became the face of that fear. When her mother and sister died, and Mercy herself fell ill soon after, neighbors began to whisper. They had seen it before. One family dying in sequence, each growing pale, coughing blood and fading away. When Mercy finally died and was buried in the frozen ground, her father, desperate and terrified, was persuaded to let the townsfolk dig up the graves. They found, they said, that Mercy's body had not decayed. Her cheeks were still pink, and when they cut her open, there was fresh blood in her heart. The conclusion was immediate and ancient. Mercy Brown was a vampire. Her heart was burned, the ashes mixed with water, and fed to her sick brother as a cure. He died anyway. The story spread like wildfire through the press. America's last vampire, they called her, but in truth, she was only the last one to be caught. Beneath the civilized surface of Gilded Age America, the fear of vampires had never truly died. The 1890s were a time when science and superstition waged quiet war. In the cities, laboratories and medical schools sought to dissect death itself. In the countryside, people still trusted charms, prayers, and midnight rituals. Spiritualists claimed to speak to the departed. Physicians tried to revive the dying with transfusions of blood. Each side was chasing the same thing, the mystery of life after death, and sometimes their paths overlapped in terrible ways. As railroads spread and cities grew, strange deaths followed. Corpses drained of blood appeared along train routes, victims of accidents that bore no visible wounds. In Boston, a physician named Dr. Alcott allegedly conducted experiments on cadavers, trying to reanimate tissue with electricity and human blood. In Louisiana, whispers told of a plantation family that had lived unnaturally long, their estate untouched by time. The newspapers dismissed it all as Gothic fantasy, but not everyone was convinced. Hidden beneath the polite society of parlors and churches, secret orders and occult societies flourished. The wealthy and educated gathered behind locked doors, studying alchemy, immortality, and the ancient rites of blood. Some were charlatans, others were not. Letters discovered decades later mention rituals involving donors and hosts, and references to the Red Communion, a term long associated with vampire cults in Europe. The American vampire was not the noble aristocrat of European myth. He was rougher, hungrier, adapted to a new land of opportunity and violence. He hid among immigrants, miners, soldiers, and factory workers. He fed in cities where the poor were invisible, and in rural towns where the dead could be buried quietly without question. The New World had not only given birth to industry and progress, it had given the old monsters a new home. By the time the century turned, something changed. The vampire stories that once filled local papers vanished. Cases like Mercy Brown's were quietly erased from medical journals and replaced with rational explanations. Officials spoke of progress and reason, of America entering a modern age. But the silence that followed was too complete. Some historians suggest that the fear faded because people learned the truth about disease. Others say it was because the vampires learned to hide better. After all, by 1899, the electric light had reached even the smallest towns, and the shadows grew fewer, but never disappeared entirely. In the glow of the modern world, the old nightmares simply changed shape. And though history tried to bury them, their names still whisper through dusty records and forgotten graveyards. The truth of the 1890s American vampires is not just about superstition. It is about the hunger that has always lived inside humanity, and the thin line between science and the supernatural. The secret history was never written in blood. It was written in silence. In the winter of 1891, the small towns scattered across New England began to share the same haunting story. Families were dying one after another, fading not in days but over weeks, drained of color and strength. The newspapers called it consumption, the White Plague, a disease that made its victims thin, pale, and ghost-like. But for those who buried their loved ones with trembling hands, the explanation felt too simple. There was something else at work, something ancient and unseen. The sickness came quietly like frost creeping through a window pane. It began with a cough, soft at first, then sharper, until blood stained the handkerchief. Nights were restless, fevers burned through the body while the heart beat slower with every breath. When one person in a family fell ill, others followed, as if the house itself had been cursed. Doctors traveled from Providence to rural Vermont, carrying little black bags filled with tonics and opium syrups, but nothing worked. It was a time before germ theory had reached the countryside, before tuberculosis had a name ordinary people could trust. Rural America still clung to old beliefs, and when reason failed, superstition returned. Some said it was the air, too damp, too thick. Others whispered that it was the dead calling to the living. The word vampire had not yet entered polite conversation, but in the corners of taverns and the shadows of barns, people used older names: Nosferatu, Upir, Revenant. Every small town had its story. In Manchester, Vermont, a farmer named Corwin swore that after his wife died, he saw her standing outside his window at night, pale and silent. He fell sick soon after, followed by his son. In Connecticut, a child told his mother that Papa comes to me when I sleep. The father had been buried 2 weeks earlier. What made this plague so terrifying was its intimacy. It did not strike strangers. It began within the family, spreading like inheritance. One would die and another would waste away. Then another. Fear crept in between love and trust. Parents slept beside their sick children, afraid to turn their backs. Windows were nailed shut, mirrors covered, hearts hardened. The local clergy preached endurance, calling the sickness a test of faith. But the people who lived with it saw no mercy in its touch. They started watching the graves, and that was when the stories turned darker. Farmers returning from the cemetery claimed to hear sounds from beneath the earth, faint knocks, the shifting of soil. Dogs howled at empty air. Graves looked disturbed, though no one had gone near them. When the frost broke, people began to dig. What they found changed everything. In one Rhode Island village, the body of a young man buried 3 months earlier was found perfectly preserved, his mouth stained with blood. In Vermont, a mother and her 2 daughters were exhumed. One of the daughters looked freshly dead, her hair grown longer in the coffin. In both cases, the villagers believed they had proof. The dead were feeding on the living. The practice that followed was brutal but accepted. They would cut open the chest, remove the heart, and burn it. Sometimes the ashes were mixed into a potion and fed to the surviving family members as protection. This ritual, horrifying to modern eyes, was born not out of cruelty, but of desperation. The people did not believe they were killing the dead. They believed they were saving the living. The newspapers, when they heard of these exhumations, were both fascinated and appalled. "Barbaric New England superstitions," one headline read. But for the people living in those towns, this was no superstition. It was survival. Among the most infamous cases was that of Mercy Lena Brown, a 19-year-old girl from Exeter, Rhode Island. When her mother and sister died of the wasting illness and her brother Edwin began to fail, Mercy herself fell sick and died. It was January 1892, the coldest winter anyone could remember. The ground was frozen solid, so her coffin was kept in an above-ground crypt until spring. By March, Edwin was near death. The townsfolk gathered at George Brown's home, insisting that one of the deceased family members was draining his life. George, broken and desperate, agreed to let them open the graves. His wife and daughter, Mary Olive, had decayed as expected. But when they opened Mercy's coffin, they found her body untouched. Her face looked lifelike, her hair long and soft, her cheeks with color. When they cut into her chest, fresh blood flowed from the heart. The villagers declared that she was the cause of the family's curse. They removed her heart and lungs, burned them on a nearby rock, and fed the ashes to Edwin. He died 2 months later. The Mercy Brown case became national news. Journalists and doctors came from Boston and New York to investigate, each offering their own explanations. Some said it was the cold that preserved her body. Others whispered that there were things science could not yet name. To this day, her grave still draws visitors who leave coins, flowers, and questions that history never answered. What made the story of Mercy Brown so powerful was not just the horror of it, but what it revealed about the people of that time. America was changing fast. Electricity, factories, telegraphs, but death was still an everyday companion. In a world without answers, the line between medicine and magic blurred. The vampire belief gave people a sense of control, however grim. It made the invisible visible. It gave a name to what terrified them. By the end of the decade, tuberculosis had been identified as the true culprit. The vampire exhumations stopped, replaced by hospital quarantines and laboratory research. But in the quiet corners of New England, the old stories lingered. Farmers still locked their barns at night. Children still refused to walk past graveyards after dark. The New World had conquered many old fears, but not all of them. The vampire, born from grief and misunderstanding, had taken root in American soil. And though science banished the superstition from headlines, the hunger that birthed it, for answers, for immortality, for the power over death, continued to pulse beneath the surface of a modern age. It was never truly about the dead rising from their graves. It was about the living and what they would do to stop their world from falling apart. Exeter, Rhode Island, 1892, a quiet farming town wrapped in frost and superstition. The morning sun was pale and lifeless, the kind that offered no warmth, only light. A thin trail of smoke rose from George Brown's chimney, curling above the snow-covered fields like a ghost searching for home. Inside that farmhouse, fear lived as a constant guest. George had lost his wife, Mary Eliza, years before to the same wasting sickness that had swept through the New England countryside. His eldest daughter, Mary Olive, followed soon after, coughing blood into her pillow while the family prayed by candlelight. Then his son, Edwin, fell ill, his breath shallow, his skin gray, his body dissolving into bones. And finally, Mercy. His youngest child, once bright and full of laughter, now lay still in a coffin inside the family crypt, buried not in the ground but above it, because the frozen earth refused to open. The villagers whispered that something unnatural was happening at the Brown farm. How could one family be struck again and again by the same cruel fate? Science had few answers, and faith was fading. Whispers turned into theories, and theories into fear. It was Edwin's worsening condition that forced George to face what he never believed in, the ancient New England superstition that the dead could feed on the living. Neighbors claimed to have seen shadows moving near the crypt at night. Some said Mercy's eyes were still open when they laid her inside. The townsfolk began to press George. "She's not gone, Mr. Brown. She's taking Edwin's life." At first, he refused. He was a rational man, a farmer who trusted in hard work, not in folklore. But as Edwin's health failed and his lips turned blue, reason gave way to desperation. On March 17, 1892, under a gray sky and a cold wind, the people of Exeter gathered with shovels, lanterns, and fear. The small cemetery lay at the edge of Chestnut Hill, a place where snow muffled every sound except the dull scrape of metal on frozen wood. George stood apart as the men pried open the crypt. Inside were 3 coffins, those of his wife, Mary Eliza, and his 2 daughters, Mary Olive and Mercy. The first 2 had decayed as expected. Only Mercy's looked untouched. When they lifted the lid, a silence fell over the crowd. Her face was not that of a girl dead for months. Her cheeks still held color. Her lips looked soft. Her hair had grown longer, thick and dark, curling over her shoulders. Someone whispered a prayer. Another crossed himself. Dr. Harold Metcalf, a local physician, stepped forward to calm the group. He explained that the cold had likely preserved her body. She had not been buried underground, after all. But his words felt small in the presence of such horror. When the heart was cut open, fresh blood trickled from it. That was enough. Science had no voice here. The villagers declared what they already believed: Mercy Brown was a vampire, By torchlight, they built a small fire on a nearby rock. Her heart and lungs were placed upon it, burning until they turned to ash. The flames hissed as if resisting the act. The ashes were collected, mixed with water, and given to Edwin as a tonic. He drank it, pale, trembling, terrified. 2 months later, he was dead. The story of the vampire of Exeter spread quickly. Within weeks, newspapers from Boston to New York printed sensational headlines. Vampire in Rhode Island. Bodies exhumed to cure the living. The journalists mocked the villagers, calling them ignorant relics of the past. But for those who lived through that winter, there was nothing foolish about fear. They had watched disease steal everything they loved, and in the absence of understanding, they turned to the oldest human instinct, to fight what they could not explain. To George Brown, the exhumation was not an act of belief but of surrender. He did what his neighbors begged him to do, because he could not bear to lose another child. When Mercy's heart burned, so did his hope. For the rest of his life, George avoided speaking of that day. He tended his fields in silence, passing the graveyard each morning. The crypt where Mercy once lay still stands, though her remains were buried properly in the earth after the ritual. Visitors say the spot feels colder than the rest of the cemetery, even in summer. Historians today view the Mercy Brown case as the final chapter of America's vampire panic, a collision of folklore, grief, and disease. Tuberculosis, the real culprit, was slow, invisible, and merciless. It could move through a family, appearing almost sentient in its choice of victims. The resemblance to the vampire myth was uncanny: pale faces, wasting bodies, blood on the lips. The connection was inevitable, but there was something deeper at play. The late 19th century was an age caught between the old world and the new. Electricity hummed through cities, but in rural America, superstition still ruled the night. When medicine failed, the old stories filled the void. The vampire became not a monster from Transylvania, but a reflection of American grief, the pain of watching loved ones die slowly, helplessly. Even today, the legend of Mercy Brown lingers in Rhode Island. Tourists leave coins, flowers, and letters on her grave, calling her both a victim and a symbol. Horror writers have immortalized her. Scholars have studied her. Some say her story inspired early vampire fiction, including Bram Stoker's Dracula, published just 5 years later. Whether or not Stoker ever heard her name, the echoes of her tragedy were in the air. And perhaps that's the real haunting. Not that Mercy Brown rose from the dead, but that the idea of her never died. The story endures because it captures something eternal about humanity, our refusal to accept death as final, our need to believe that love, even cursed, distorted love, can reach beyond the grave. Mercy's tale is not one of monsters, but of mourning. Her vampirism was born not of darkness, but of desperation, of a father's last terrible hope. In the end, the ashes meant to save Edwin could not stop fate. The plague continued, as it always did, indifferent to fire or prayer. But for a few moments on that frozen March day, the people of Exeter believed they had power over death. And that belief, however grim, gave them comfort. Mercy Brown never harmed anyone, but her legend still feeds on us, century after century, because it reminds us of the one truth we fear the most. Sometimes the real horror is not in the grave. It's in the living heart that refuses to let go. The late 19th century was an age of marvels. Telegraphs sang through copper veins, trains thundered across the land, and laboratories glowed with the promise of discovery. Yet beneath that golden optimism, fear persisted like a fever that science could not break. The American people, desperate to understand the invisible forces killing their families, turned to both doctors and the dead for answers. Consumption, the word itself sounded delicate, almost poetic, was anything but. The disease stole breath, blood, and warmth from its victims until only shadows of life remained. It could pass silently through a home, claiming one child, then another, then the mother who nursed them. To doctors, it was an epidemic. To villagers, it was vampirism. The line between medicine and myth was thin, and the men who called themselves physicians often walked it uneasily. In cities, they spoke the language of science, infection, contagion, and cellular decay. But in towns like Exeter, Rhode Island, or Woodstock, Vermont, that vocabulary met blank, fearful stares. The people did not want explanations about invisible germs. They wanted the evil to stop. Dr. Harold Metcalf, the physician who oversaw the exhumation of Mercy Brown, understood this conflict all too well. He was a man of learning, educated in Providence, and proud of his modern mind. When George Brown agreed to open the graves of his family, Metcalf insisted on attending, not to encourage the act, but to protect reason itself. He arrived with a small leather bag of instruments, a notebook, and the conviction that he could disprove the superstition. The March wind cut through his coat as he watched the townsfolk dig through the frozen earth. They were farmers, mill workers, widows, and children, a cross-section of rural America holding their faith against the darkness. When they opened the coffins, Metcalf recorded his observations with clinical detachment. The body of Mercy Lena Brown is found in an excellent state of preservation. The viscera retain fluid blood, likely due to the extreme cold. But when the heart was cut open and fresh blood flowed, his certainty wavered. The villagers' faces said what his education refused to. They had seen proof, and in that moment he understood that reason could not always compete with fear. Metcalf did not stop them when they burned the heart. He did not intervene when they mixed the ashes with water and fed it to Edwin Brown. Instead, he stepped back, silently observing as the smoke rose like a prayer to a god he no longer recognized. In the days that followed, the newspapers feasted on the story. Vampires in New England, the headlines screamed. Journalists mocked the people of Exeter as backward, ignorant, clinging to medieval superstitions. But behind the laughter lay something more unsettling. A shared unease that perhaps the villagers were not entirely wrong, because consumption did look like vampirism. The pale skin, the hollow eyes, the red lips stained with blood after a coughing fit. It was easy to see why frightened families imagined something feeding on them. The physicians knew better, yet they could not cure it, and that failure haunted them. In medical schools, young doctors dissected lungs that looked like honeycombs, blackened and hollow. They debated the nature of contagion, but even the word infection had not yet taken its modern form. The germ theory of disease was new, fragile, and resisted by many. Some physicians still believed in miasma, poisonous air, while others began to suspect something smaller, invisible, alive. But to the grieving mother who had buried 3 children, these were just words. What she saw was a monster. Reports of other vampire exhumations spread quietly across New England. In Vermont, the Spaulding family dug up the body of their daughter Rachel after 2 brothers fell ill. In Connecticut, a farmer claimed to have burned his wife's liver to stop her spirit from draining his children. Doctors often arrived too late, to study, to explain, or simply to witness the collapse of reason. Privately, many of them were shaken. Diaries from the era revealed doubts they could not voice publicly. One physician from Providence wrote, "The villagers' belief is not born of ignorance, but of despair. We call them fools, but they only seek what we all seek, mastery over death." As tuberculosis spread, so too did the fear of it. Doctors carried its shadow in their minds. They knew how easily it passed, how it lingered in air and cloth. They wore gloves and masks not out of superstition but survival. Yet to the villagers, these same precautions seemed like witchcraft in reverse. Science was supposed to drive out fear, but in the 1890s it merely gave fear new language. The vampire of folklore became the microbe of medicine, unseen, unstoppable, feeding silently on the living. The tools changed, but the dread remained the same. By the end of the century, as germ theory solidified and hospitals became temples of sterile precision, the old vampire stories faded. Doctors no longer faced mobs with shovels, only laboratories with microscopes. But they carried the memory of what it meant to fail, to see fear win over knowledge. The physicians of the vampire panic were not villains or heroes. They were witnesses to a time when the boundary between myth and medicine dissolved. Their hands touched both flesh and fear, and in doing so, they became part of the legend they tried to dispel. Even now, when we speak of disease spreading through families, of invisible forces leeching life away, we echo their vocabulary. We say something feeds on us, something drains us, something infects. The words have changed, but the meaning endures. In the end, the doctors who fought the vampire myth discovered something far more terrifying. It was not the dead that haunted the living. It was the living who could not stop fearing death. By the time the Mercy Brown case faded from newspaper ink, the whispers had already spread far beyond Rhode Island's frozen fields. Across the Atlantic, Europe was captivated by tales of vampires and strange American rituals. But in the United States, something darker was stirring. Not in folklore, but in drawing rooms, laboratories, and candlelit basements, where science, faith, and obsession merged into one forbidden pursuit. They called themselves the Red Communion. The origins of this society were uncertain. Some said it began among physicians fascinated by the supposed immortality of blood, a secret circle of men who studied its properties not for healing, but for transcendence. Others believed it had older roots, stretching back to European occult traditions imported by immigrants who carried with them both superstition and hunger for power. What was certain is that by the 1890s, chapters of the Red Communion had appeared quietly in cities like Boston, New Orleans, and Philadelphia. They operated behind the veil of social clubs and scientific associations, attracting doctors, scholars, and wealthy patrons. Publicly, they discussed anatomy, disease, and the mysteries of life. Privately, they conducted experiments few would dare imagine. Their doctrine was simple: life resides in the blood. To prolong life, one must commune with it, share it, consume it. This belief was not entirely unfounded in the context of the era. Medicine had just begun exploring blood transfusion. Scientists like Jean-Baptiste Denis and James Blundell had proven that one life's blood could, at least temporarily, sustain another. But where legitimate science ended, the cult's fascination began. Within the shadowed halls of their meetings, the Red Communion performed what they called vital exchanges. Members would gather around a marble altar, often adorned with chalices of silver and glass, and recite a mix of Latin prayers and modern scientific terms, a strange fusion of religion and research. Then, under candlelight, they would pierce their arms and allow the blood to flow, mixing in a communal vessel. Some drank it, others applied it to their skin, believing it could rejuvenate cells and grant longevity. Whispers claimed that not all the blood came willingly. In some circles, it was said that vagrants and prostitutes disappeared from the streets near their meeting places. Police records from Boston in 1893 mention a medical fraternity investigated for grave robbery and illegal autopsies, though no arrests were made. The files vanished months later. To the public eye, the 1890s were a decade of modern miracles. Electricity, telephones, and railroads made people feel that the impossible was becoming possible. And yet, beneath that optimism, the Red Communion's rituals revealed a darker truth. The human desire for immortality had not evolved. It had merely changed its disguise. One of the most infamous figures associated with the cult was Dr. Elias Worthington, a physician from Philadelphia, whose private journals were discovered long after his death. His writings described secret experiments conducted in the basement of his estate, where he injected blood from healthy patients into those dying of tuberculosis. He claimed temporary success, a return of color to their faces, strength to their limbs, followed by madness, fever, and death. In one entry dated October 1894, he wrote, "I have glimpsed the threshold between life and eternity. The blood does not only carry sustenance, it carries memory, will, and perhaps the soul itself." Worthington vanished in 1896 after his house was found abandoned. Rumors spoke of a final experiment, one that required his own blood to be drained and replaced entirely. His body was never found. By the turn of the century, reports of similar societies emerged across the country. In Savannah, Charleston, and even Chicago, where a group calling itself the Order of Vital Restoration met in old hospitals. Some believed they were descendants of the Red Communion, others an imitation. What united them was a shared conviction that the boundary between science and magic could be crossed through blood. The newspapers never reported these events. The institutions that might have exposed them, the church, the press, the law, all looked the other way, perhaps out of disbelief, perhaps because some of their own were involved. The cult's members often came from the same class that financed hospitals, funded universities, and built the modern world. They hid their obsession under philanthropy and progress, masking ritual with research. And so, while the vampire legends of rural America died out, a more intellectual, more insidious form of vampirism thrived in the cities, one that did not need fangs, only needles and conviction. Historians today struggle to separate fact from myth. The Red Communion left few traces, fragments of coded letters, medical records marked with strange symbols, and a handful of death certificates bearing unexplainable causes. Some even suggest that the cult never existed at all, that it was an invention of paranoid clergy or scandal-hungry journalists. Yet the consistency of the accounts, stretching from New England to the Deep South, tells another story. The fear of vampires had evolved, from corpses rising in the graveyards to men in coats and gloves, draining life in laboratories. The monster had become civilized. In 1898, a small Boston newspaper published a story titled "The Society of Blood: Doctors Who Worship Immortality." The article was quickly retracted, the editor dismissed, and the original issue destroyed. Only one copy survived in a private archive. The author wrote, "These men do not believe they are evil. They believe they are saving mankind from death, and in that belief lies the greatest horror of all." The following year, Bram Stoker's Dracula was released. Many readers saw it as pure fiction, but some who knew the whispers recognized echoes of truth, the fascination with blood, the idea of vitality transfused from one being to another, the illusion of eternal life at terrible cost. Whether or not Stoker ever heard of the Red Communion remains uncertain. What is certain is that both the vampire myth and the cult were born of the same hunger, the refusal to accept mortality, the human desire to live forever, no matter the price. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, America buried its ghosts under the shining face of modernity, but beneath that polished surface, the cult's ideals survived, in experiments, in research, in every obsession with youth and life extension that followed. The Red Communion may have vanished, but its doctrine never died, because even now, in the veins of progress, the same old thirst still flows. By 1893, the vampire panic of New England had quieted, but in the deep, humid South, another form of darkness had begun to stir. But the myth endured. For decades, whispers of the Blood Society lingered among physicians and occultists. Some believed its teachings survived under new names, hidden within universities and medical lodges. Others said the organization had gone deeper underground, perfecting Harrow's dream in secret, trading blood for longevity in deals made behind closed doors. A century later, the ruins of Harrow's estate remain sunken beneath the swamp. Tourists visit, posing for photographs near the overgrown cemetery. They laugh about ghosts and southern legends. But locals refuse to stay after dark. They say the air turns thick, the smell of iron fills the nose. And sometimes, just beyond the water's edge, a woman's figure glows faintly before fading into the reeds. No one knows if she was Celeste or something older wearing her face. But those who have seen her speak of a feeling that lingers, a pull in the chest, a slowing of the pulse, a whisper in the blood that says, "Softly and without mercy I am not gone," and in that moment, beneath the southern moon, every heartbeat sounds like her name. By the turn of the 20th century, the story of American vampires had begun to blur the line between history and myth. The scattered remnants of the Red Communion had either been hunted, hidden, or consumed by their own creation, but the hunger that fueled them didn't die. It adapted, evolving into something new, something that could move undetected through the glittering progress of the modern age. In 1908, a series of disappearances in Chicago drew the attention of both the press and the police. Victims were all from the working class, factory girls, dock laborers, immigrants with no family. Their bodies were found days later in alleys or near the river, pale as porcelain, their blood drained yet with no wounds large enough to explain the loss. The city's coroner dismissed the cases as medical anomalies, but privately the pattern disturbed him. The bodies showed signs of transfusion punctures, clean and deliberate, as if done by a skilled hand. The whispers began again, first among the doctors, then the journalists, and finally in the streets. The red men have returned. Some said it was the work of cultists who had inherited the communion's secrets. Others believed the blood itself had survived, passed down through generations, diluted, but never extinguished. One physician even claimed to have isolated a strain of it, calling it sanguis heroi, blood that refused to clot, that healed faster than any natural sample, that remembered its donor long after separation. In truth, a few of the old society's remnants had survived. They had learned from the failures of their forebears, replacing ritual with science, sanctuaries with laboratories. They no longer gathered in mansions or swamps, but in urban clinics funded by medical progress. They called themselves the Renewal, and their goal was not immortality in the old, crude sense. They wanted controlled evolution, to purify bloodlines, to breed out weakness, to create humanity perfected. To the outside world, they appeared as philanthropists and innovators. They donated to hospitals, founded research centers, and preached the virtues of hygiene and longevity. But beneath the respectable surface, their work was fueled by the same obsession that had driven Dr. Harrow, the belief that human life could be endlessly sustained by the essence of others. Rumors persisted that the Renewal maintained an archive of preserved blood dating back to the 1830s. Hidden within those vials, some said, was the original strain of Celeste's blood, the living blood, the source of every aberration since. Its custodians, unable to destroy it, kept it sealed in a silver vessel and fed it small offerings once a decade. One report from 1912, buried in the archives of the New Orleans Herald, described a private demonstration for wealthy patrons at a new clinic of rejuvenation. Witnesses spoke of a woman strapped to a table, her veins glowing faintly under the lamplight, her skin radiant even in death. The procedure was meant to transfer vital energy from one host to another. The donor never survived. The recipient awoke younger, stronger, but with eyes that reflected candlelight red. Within months, the clinic burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. The official cause was electrical failure. Unofficially, some believed the fire was set to contain something that had escaped. After that, sightings of the Blood Woman began to appear across America, from Savannah to St. Louis, from New York to San Francisco. Always the same, a pale woman in black, eyes like garnets, a presence that chilled the air. Wherever she appeared, someone vanished soon after. Witnesses claimed she never aged, never spoke, only watched. By 1920, the myth of vampires had evolved from European folklore into a distinctly American legend. Industrial, scientific, and born of progress itself. No longer creatures of superstition, they were products of experiment and ambition. The vampire was no longer a figure of the night, but a reflection of human desire to master life, to consume youth, to never fade. And beneath the glow of electric lights, in cities built on steel and blood, that hunger found new forms. Not every vampire had fangs. Some wore lab coats, others suits and gold watches. They fed not in dark forests, but in hospitals and factories, draining workers and donors in the name of advancement. The thirst for immortality had simply gone professional. Yet even among them, there remained whispers of her, Celeste, the first and the last. The living blood that could not be replicated, the vessel that walked between death and divinity. Her legend endured not because she sought followers, but because humanity could never resist chasing her shadow. She was the price of its ambition, the ghost in its veins. And so, while the world raced toward modernity, telegraphs, automobiles, the birth of cinema, something ancient watched in silence. It did not need to hunt. Mankind brought it offerings willingly. Pints of blood, studies of longevity, dreams of perfection. The story of the American vampire was no longer about monsters hiding in the dark. It was about what happened when man learned to hide the dark inside himself. By 1925, the myth had completed its transformation. What had once been whispered in backwoods towns and burned in superstition now flowed freely through the veins of progress itself. The age of candle-lit rituals and graveyard desecrations had ended. The new vampires were born under electric light and marble ceilings. They were not monsters in cloaks. but men and women in laboratories, dressed in white, their hunger refined into science. The renewal had spread quietly through America's medical and industrial elite. Its members funded blood banks, hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies. What began as a cult of secrecy had become a system of commerce. The blood that once bound them in ritual was now a commodity, drawn, labeled, and sold. Blood for life, one advertisement boasted in 1927, promising vitality through transfusion therapy. Patients lined up eagerly, unaware that behind the curtain, the blood source was far from ordinary. At the heart of it all remained the myth of Celeste, the living blood. Her existence had become a legend among the initiates. Some believed she had vanished, destroyed in the fire that consumed Harrow's clinic. Others claimed she still lived, hidden in cryogenic sleep, her veins carrying the secret of eternal regeneration. Whatever the truth, her influence endured. Every experiment, every transfusion, every drop of blood taken in the name of progress, it all led back to her. By now, the hunger had evolved beyond flesh and blood. It was no longer about drinking or feeding, but about control, of youth, of time, of mortality itself. The renewal's researchers pursued a dream of biologic immortality, dissecting the line between human and divine. They called it Project Dawn. The goal was simple: harness the regenerative power found in select strains of blood to reverse aging and disease. But progress always demands sacrifice. Subjects disappeared. Volunteers were lost to complications, and soon investigators began to notice. In 1928, a journalist named Evelyn Cross uncovered a string of missing persons linked to a series of experimental clinics in Chicago, New Orleans, and Baltimore. She followed the trail to a private estate owned by a wealthy benefactor, a descendant of the original plantation owners tied to the communion. What she found there was never published. Her notes ended mid-sentence, the last line reading only, "The blood is awake." In the years that followed, the renewal fractured under pressure. Laboratories were raided, records destroyed, and its members dispersed across continents. Yet the knowledge they had unearthed refused to die. It survived in fragments, in medical journals, in coded letters, in university vaults sealed under anonymity. By the time the Second World War began, whispers of Project Dawn reappeared in government files under new titles: Biological Enhancement, Vita Serum, Operation Helios. Each generation renamed the sin, but never erased it. The legend of Celeste became folklore again, then rumor, then conspiracy. A woman who never aged. A strain of blood that healed all wounds. A secret buried beneath the name of progress. Some said she had finally died. Others claimed she walked among the living, her blood diluted through centuries, carried unknowingly by those who sought eternal life. And perhaps that was the final horror. Not that vampires once haunted America, but that they never truly left. They changed form, adapted, merged with human ambition. The hunger for immortality, the thirst for perfection, the desire to live forever. It all remained, dressed now in the language of medicine and science. By the dawn of the modern age, the line between myth and reality had dissolved entirely. The vampire was no longer a creature of the night. It was the pulse that drove civilization forward, the endless human craving for more life, more youth, more time. In laboratories and boardrooms, in hospitals and war rooms, the old dream still whispered, life eternal, bought with the blood of others. Celeste's legacy had become humanity's reflection, its brilliance, its greed, its curse. And so the secret history of the American vampire did not end in the 1890s. It simply evolved, following mankind wherever it dared to reach beyond the limits of its own mortality. Even now, beneath the fluorescent hum of modern hospitals, the same hunger stirs. Machines measure it, needles harvest it, scientists name it something new every decade: longevity, genetics, rejuvenation. But deep down, it's the same story told in every century. The blood remembers, and it always wants more.